Imagine walking into a real estate office ready to buy your dream home, only to be told by the agent that the houses you're interested in are too expensive for you. That's exactly what happened to Sarah, a young professional with big dreams and an even bigger budget. She had spent months saving, researching neighborhoods, and envisioning her future in a beautiful, spacious home. But when she walked into the office of Lux Living Realty, the agent, a polished woman named Linda, barely glanced at her before dismissing her aspirations. "Oh, honey, those properties are way out of your league," Linda said with a condescending smile, pushing a stack of listings for tiny, outdated homes instead. Sarah felt a mix of frustration and embarrassment, but something about Linda's dismissive tone lit a fire in her. Little did Linda know, Sarah wasn't just any potential buyer. She was the CEO of the development company that built those expensive houses. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah calmly reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the desk. Linda's eyes widened as she read the name. Sarah Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Developments. The color drained from her face as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Mitchell Developments wasn't just any company. It was one of the most prestigious real estate developers in the region, responsible for some of the most luxurious and sought-after properties in the area. Sarah had built her company from the ground up, starting as a young architect with a vision and growing it into a multi-million-dollar empire. She had come to Lux Living Realty not just to buy a home, but to see how her properties were being represented to potential buyers, and what she discovered was shocking. As Sarah stood there watching Linda stammer and try to backtrack, she couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disappointment. How many other buyers had been turned away from their dream homes because of Linda's assumptions? How many people had been made to feel small and unworthy simply because they didn't fit a certain stereotype? Sarah knew she had to do something, but she also knew that this wasn't just about Linda. This was about a bigger issue in the real estate industry, one that she had the power to change. But before she could make her next move, the office door swung open, and in walked the owner of Lux Living Realty, a man named Greg who had a reputation for being as ruthless as he was successful. He took one look at the scene unfolding in front of him and immediately sized up the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm, but laced with authority. Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The room fell silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would Greg side with his agent, or would he realize the gravity of the situation? And more importantly, what would Sarah do next? The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension was far from over. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of a story that would change everything. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her eyes locked with Greg's. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Greg was a tall, imposing figure with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. He had built Lux Living Realty from nothing, just like Sarah had with Mitchell Developments. But while Sarah prided herself on integrity and fairness, Greg's reputation was a little more complicated. Rumors swirled about his cutthroat business tactics and his ability to close deals at any cost. Sarah had heard the stories, but she'd never crossed paths with him directly, until now. "I asked what's going on here," Greg repeated, his voice calm but firm. Linda, still visibly shaken, opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah beat her to it. "Your agent here seems to think I can't afford the properties I'm interested in," Sarah said, her tone steady but laced with an edge. She held up the stack of listings Linda had pushed toward her, the ones for the small, outdated homes that were a far cry from the luxury properties she had come to see. Greg's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to Sarah. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Greg's lips curled into a slow, calculating smile. "Well, that's certainly a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "Linda, why don't you take a break?" Linda hesitated, clearly unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. She glanced at Sarah, then at Greg, before nodding and quickly exiting the room. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Sarah and Greg alone. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure what to expect from Greg, but she wasn't about to back down. Greg, on the other hand, seemed to be sizing her up, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Sarah Mitchell," he said finally, his tone almost amused. "I've heard a lot about you. Youngest CEO in the industry, self-made, visionary, impressive." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And yet, your agent didn't seem to recognize me," she said dryly. Greg chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, let's just say she's not the best at reading people. But that's not why you're here, is it?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't planned on revealing her true intention so soon, but Greg's directness caught her off guard. "I came to see how my properties are being represented," she admitted. "And I have to say I'm not impressed." Greg's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of something darker, more calculating. "Ah, so this is about more than just a misunderstanding," he said, leaning casually against the edge of Linda's desk. "You're here to, what, audit us? See if we're worthy of selling your precious developments?" Sarah met his gaze evenly. "I'm here to make sure my clients, the people buying my homes, are being treated fairly. And from what I've seen so far, that's not happening." Greg's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He straightened up, his hands sliding into his pockets as he took a step closer to Sarah. "You know, Sarah, the real estate world isn't as black and white as you might think," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Sometimes you have to play the game." Sarah frowned. "What game?" she asked, though she had a feeling she already knew the answer. Greg's lips twitched, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. "You've built an impressive empire," he said after a moment. "But you're still new to this. You don't know how things really work. Not yet." Sarah felt a flicker of unease, but she refused to let it show. "Enlighten me," she said, her voice steady. Greg turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say that not everyone in this industry plays by the rules," he said. "And if you want to survive, you'll have to learn how to navigate that." Sarah's mind raced. Was he threatening her, warning her? She couldn't tell. But one thing was clear. Greg wasn't just a rival, he was a wild card. And he knew something she didn't. Before she could respond, Greg's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and then looked back at Sarah. "I'm afraid I have to take this," he said, his tone polite but dismissive. "But I'd love to continue this conversation. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? We can discuss business." Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure she trusted Greg, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Not yet. There was too much at stake. "Fine," she said finally. "Tomorrow." Greg smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Looking forward to it," he said, before turning and walking out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. As the door closed, behind him, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had just happened. Greg was clearly hiding something, but what? And why had he been so cryptic? She knew she needed to tread carefully, but she also knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people who trusted her to build their dream homes, the people who deserved to be treated with respect and fairness. And if Greg, or anyone else, stood in the way of that, she would do whatever it took to make things right. But as she left the office and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much bigger and much more dangerous than she had anticipated. The real estate world was a battlefield, and Greg was just the first opponent she'd encountered. Who else was out there, waiting in the shadows? And what would they do to protect their secrets? Sarah didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. And the next morning, Sarah arrived at Greg's office, a sleek modern building in the heart of the city. She had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying their conversation in her mind. Greg's words had been vague, but the underlying message was clear. There was more to the real estate world than she knew, and not all of it was pretty. As she stepped into the elevator, she couldn't help but feel a mix of determination and unease. She was walking into the lion's den, and she knew it, but she also knew she couldn't back down, not when so much was at stake. Greg's office was on the top floor, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. He was seated behind a large, polished desk when she walked in, but he stood immediately, a smile spreading across his face. "Sarah," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it." Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm. "I'm here," she said simply, her tone neutral. Greg gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She did, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap, her posture confident but not confrontational. She was here to listen, to learn, and to figure out what Greg was really up to. Greg leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "You're a smart woman, Sarah. You've built something incredible with Mitchell Developments. But the real estate world, it's not just about building houses. It's about power, influence, and knowing how to play the game." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And what game are we talking about exactly?" Greg's smile didn't waver. "The game of control," he said. "You see, in this industry, it's not enough to just build the best properties. You have to control the market, the buyers, the agents. You have to know how to manipulate the system to your advantage." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. "And how exactly do you do that?" she asked, her voice steady. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Let's just say there are ways to ensure your properties are the most sought after," he said. "Ways to influence buyers, to control prices, to make sure your competition doesn't stand a chance." Sarah's mind raced. Was he talking about illegal practices? Manipulation? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to tread carefully. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked. Greg's smile widened. "Everything," he said. "You're a rising star, Sarah. But if you want to stay at the top, you need to learn how to play the game, and I can teach you." Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't like where this was going, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Not yet. She needed to know more. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, her tone cautious. Greg leaned back again, his expression thoughtful. "Let's just say I see potential in you," he said. "And I'm always looking for partners." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah's mind raced. Was Greg offering her a partnership? Or was this some kind of trap? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't trust him. Not completely. "I'll think about it," she said finally, standing up. Greg nodded, his smile never wavering. "Take your time," he said. "But remember, Sarah, the game doesn't wait for anyone, and neither do I." As Sarah left the office, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew Greg was dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what he had said. There was something bigger going on in the real estate world, something she had only just begun to scratch the surface of. And if she wanted to protect her company and her clients, she would have to dive deeper, even if it meant getting her hands dirty. But as she stepped out into the bright sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the busy street, but she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling lingered, a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't quite place. Was it paranoia, or was there something, or someone, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? Sarah didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number, and it contained just 3 words. "Watch your back." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around again, her unease growing. Who had sent the message, and what did they know? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in deeper than she had ever imagined.